The Stupid Queen, Episode 2. Having changed his entire wardrobe, but with no time to bathe, Porfirio was in a bit of a hurry to get the lingering stench of vomit off of him. They were crossing the bridge now, hovering over the canyon. The Duke had already calculated everything. He trotted the stallion to the edge of the bridge next to the bulwark, looking over to where the falls bubbled into the river about a mile down. So close to the edge, Giropat tried to look over her shoulder at him, confused and unnerved. He held tight, preparing to rear the horse and throw her over the edge, when he grew short of breath, and a sharp pain shot through his arm, just as the horse began to lift. Instead, he lost his grip on the reins and fell backward. Giropat gripped the pommel and reached back, grabbing him by the doublet and easing him forward as the horse calmed. She examined his red face, and the vein popping out on his forehead, and then watched as his whole body relaxed at once, and he caught his breath again. Her mouth gaped in disgust, looking at his nethers, presuming he'd finally gotten off on riding against her rump. She growled and slapped him across the face, dismounting and marching the rest of the way across the bridge to the palace. The Duke's saucer eyes fluttered in shock.
"Are you all right, Your Grace?"
Porfirio held up his hand and nodded, still red. Their arrival at the palace was sounded off by horns off the parapets. Gerard, her brother, dashed into the courtyard.
"What the hell were you thinking?"
Giropat flounced over in a fluff of fabric, pausing in front of her brother. She gave a soft smile. "Thinking? Me?" She marched toward a gaggle of maids and began throwing off items of clothing for them to catch, ranting about how she needed a proper bath. Gerard scowled, waiting until she was far enough away and addressing his guest.
"Why isn't she dead, Porfirio?"
Porfirio eased off of his horse, remaining collected. It was in his best interest to avoid divulging any weaknesses, especially a heart condition.
"My poisoner believes she is immune to the salts he put in her bath. Perhaps too many attempts on her life?"
The Duke answered, corking his brow at the prince. It was true. From an early age, Gerard had begun his experimentations. Naturally, as a 12-year-old, he didn't have skilled poisoners at his beck and call, so he dabbled in the art himself. Giropat had touched, drank, eaten, breathed, and swam in various poisons, all before she was a teenager. Gerard silently cursed himself for not increasing the dose on his very first attempt. If he had, he probably would have been king by now. "I can't believe you told them, Dula. I was worried about you, Highness. Them's thieves in Tovia. Murderers." Dula hustled toward her with a cup of rouge and a brush. She attempted to put it on with her shaky hand, but Giropat tore herself away, flapping her hands to shoo the nurse. "Ugh, what's the matter with you? I'll do it." Giropat hastily dabbed the rouge over her lips and cheeks and turned. "I should have been ready half an hour ago. I need some smoke. Where is my smoke?" Dula searched for the Ming herb best suited to the situation, one that would calm the princess. She loaded the pipe and struck a match, putting it up to the girl's lips so she could take a toke. Giropat inhaled deeply, her eyes practically rolling in her head. She held the smoke in for a moment and then exhaled like a dragon, taking another puff shortly after, and then another. When she was through, she sat and gazed off to the side for a good 5 minutes until Dula held out her dress. Disoriented, Giropat stood and allowed her nurse to do the rest. Her mind wandered to the secret civilization of the bugs crawling on the orange peels next to her desk. She wondered if they had a princess and if she was in the same predicament, torn between ruling her country and running away. Then she realized a bug princess was probably in a worse position than herself, because usually an insect queen was forced to sit around and lay eggs all day. Ugh! Giropat's noise of disgust echoed off of the cavernous, vaulted ceiling. It was only then that she realized that the Ming root had altered her sense of time. She had no memory of what had occurred between contemplating bugs on orange peels and her arrival at the throne room. The processional fanfare sounded off before she could gain her bearings. A sea of eyes stared at her. Dukes, barons, lords, ambassadors, and their counterparts from all over the world attended the coronation that took place within the massive room. With a lake for a floor, one could hear even the slightest whisper bounce off of the surface from one end of the room to the other, including the gossip Giropat caught wind of as she passed. She looks like a blitzed fairy. Rather rotund for an addict, don't you think? Giropat's late arrival made Gerard hopeful that maybe his sister had fallen over the ledge of the courtyard and into the falls. He was only 5 minutes younger than she, and yet she was the one dragging the customary 50-yard robe down the aisle. The most power he would ever have would be a seat on the council and a prince's crown, unless, universe forbid, his sister died. Still dizzy, Giropat arrived at the altar and accepted a goblet from the holy man, who bid her to fill it at the waterfall behind the throne. She would drink the water and recite the words she'd been memorizing since, honestly, she'd only glanced at it once, maybe a week ago, but she was pretty sure she had it down. Giropat scuffed to the waterfall, filled her cup, drank sloppily, and let the water dribble down her chin. This was the graceful cow who would be ruling their country. Her brother couldn't help but shake his head and stare at his boots, wishing she no longer existed. Holding out the goblet, she spoke the words. I, Giropat Algania, drink of the falls. They flow through my veins and into my heart, ensuring that I and the country are one and the same. She smiled and nodded with satisfaction, taking a few steps backward and slumping into the throne, proud of herself. The holy man stared at her dumbfounded for a moment, looking out to the audience with eyes wide. Tiptoeing over to his future queen, he bent down and whispered,
Your Grace, you haven't finished your declaration.
There's more. Giropat jumped to her feet and stepped forward, horrified. Her eyes darted back and forth in their sockets, searching her brain for anything she might have forgotten.
Do you vow to protect this country as you would your own life?
The holy man piped in. Yes! Giropat nodded eagerly.
To give this country a worthy heir?
Yes, I suppose.
And if this country dies, then you die with it?
Giropat whipped her head to the holy man in surprise. Really? Well, yes. If we're speaking in metaphors. The holy man gave a weak smile and nod, lifting the crown from its pedestal. The large and garish circle of gold glinted and sparkled, and the holy man gave a sudden gasp when the eyesore of the empty jewel socket came into view.
The Great Emerald! The Great Emerald is missing!
There was an uproar throughout the crowd as each court member and attendee gave one another looks of accusation and searched the room for the culprit.
Guards, seize him!
Gerard's bellow echoed across the hall as he pointed toward the holy man. The guards grabbed the poor old priest as he held up his arms and exclaimed his innocence. Amongst all the chaos and confusion, a pair of lanky boots stood their ground, perfectly calm and collected. They turned on a heel and lazily vacated the throne room, confidently stepping from stone to stone until the man they carried reached the aisle. The Duke. He smirked with satisfaction and disappeared into the crowd of concerned lords and ladies, spotting one young little bird by herself and swooping in on her. She was a slight little dirty blonde in an orange dress. He made sure the patch on his boil was in place before engaging her.
Francesca, you little minx,
he said, gripping the lady by her waist and pulling her close to him, his chest against her back. He discreetly plucked a flower from an arrangement and handed it to her, leaning in to whisper in her ear.
You're like the sunset. You make my eyes weak.
Oh. The girl turned, flushed and wooed, to greet the stranger. The Duke feigned surprise.
1,000 pardons, my lady. I thought you were my fiancée, though. I see now that I've proposed to the wrong woman,
he said, eyeing her up and down. Once he was allowed to introduce himself as the Duke, his conquest was defeated. His bed would be quite warm that night. Giropat waited in the council room where her eyes wandered. The drab old men shuffled about, reading, writing, murmuring. She crawled her fingers across the table toward a blank sheet of paper like a sneaky child, her gaze flitting about the room, checking to make sure no one was watching. When she was sure she wouldn't be caught, she swept it into her lap, seizing a quill, dipping it into the messy well, and hiding her artifacts underneath the table.
Councilman, we've just had word from over the border.
Occupied by the drawing, her reaction was the exact opposite of the others when her stern-browed twin entered the room, followed by the Duke, who waved a message around.
My spies have spotted a suspicious character crossing the border into Tovia this morning. A man, black of hair and dark of eye,
The Duke said. Gerard nodded.
A man fitting the same description was seen leaving the castle before dawn. As Tovia is out of our jurisdiction, the Duke assures us he will take every measure to have our man captured and swiftly executed.
Gerard looked to his sister, who gave no concern or reaction at the suggestion of an execution.
The question remains, will we be able to crown our queen with a substitute diadem?
Advisor Winston shook his head frantically.
It is out of the question. The law states that only a crown fitted with the great emerald can represent the heart of the country.
Gerard nodded.
Very well then. Giropat, I'm sorry, but your coronation will have to wait. Until we find the emerald, I'm afraid we must consider this interruption indefinite.
Giropat gave a distracted nod.
Giropat?
Gerard's eyes fell to her lap, discovering the paper and ripping it from her hands to find a finely detailed phallus in all its erect glory. The Duke leaned over to observe the masterpiece, and the corner of his mouth twisted upward. In a rage, Gerard crumpled up the drawing as Giropat snorted with smothered laughter. Throwing the paper violently to the floor, Gerard slammed his fists on the oak table.
Is this a joke to you? Your crown has been vandalized, thereby holding this country at a standstill. Do you even care?
During the silence that followed, the councilmen awkwardly averted their eyes. The Duke watched, sleepily, silently affirming that yes, it would be better if the princess was assassinated.
How are we even related? If you would have stayed in our mother just 5 more minutes, this country would stand for something, instead of being the laughing stock of the planet.
Giropat's large eyes rolled up from her lap to meet her brother's. They were welling with tears. The cord was wrapped around her neck, making the urgency of her birth a life or death matter. Gerard knew this. Gerard knew that if she would have stayed in their mother 5 more minutes, she wouldn't have come out alive.
Dula,
He called out the council room door. The nurse came rushing in shortly.
the princess is crying again. See to it that our needs are met.
An hour later, sufficiently liquored up, Giropat ate bonbons spread out on her fainting couch in her knickers and corset. The ganache filling gooed up her lips and teeth as she gave ugly sobs. I wish I was dead! Dula bustled about the room, warming blankets in an oven and wetting a washcloth. She cupped the young woman's messy face and began wiping Giropat down as if she were a child. Fetch me the Forest Rogue. I wish to read. The Forest Rogue, a story about a female hunter who becomes a powerful leader of the forest nymphs. The pages were weak from use. Dula prepared the princess a pipe, and Giropat took it without looking away from the pages of her book. She read for hours about the female rogue's humble beginnings, foraging for berries, learning about animals, crafting weapons, and hunting with them. Such an unusual life. A girl learning a man's work. A girl. A man. Giropat sat upright. Paper! I need paper! Dula! I have a plan! Dula? The princess attempted to shove a bonbon in the woman's mouth as some sort of remedy to her fatigue, which Dula coughed and then spit out, a dish of half-eaten pastries slipping from her lap and clattering in a mess on the floor. It is widely known that I am a stupid girl. Before Dula could contest the statement, Giropat rolled off of her couch. But what if I became a man? Dula's mouth opened slightly, unsure of just what her princess was saying. I've made a list. Giropat cleared her throat and read aloud. What high-born men do. Number 1. Sleep with anyone. You have my sponge, right? You packed that? Dula nodded, her mouth agog. Number 2. Become an expert horseman. Number 3. Master a sword and other weapons. Number 4. Learn the art of social foreplay. Dula made a noise at the word foreplay. Giropat looked at her and stood, pacing the room. Yes, I suppose that isn't the right word, is it? I meant climbing the social ladder. I must become quick-witted. I must expand my knowledge in all things. I need a lady's maid, an expert in weapons, and a horse master. Giropat looked at Dula expectantly. Well, go on. Dula scrambled to her feet, her chubby legs carrying her to the door as she looked back at Giropat a few times, unsure. Go, Giropat waved. Days later, Gerard made a visit to Tovia.
Your Highness, I promise my uncle is doing everything in his power to find this foul criminal and bring him to...
Prince Radburn of Tovia fell into a coughing fit before he could finish. Gerard covered his mouth with the back of his hand and took a discreet step backward. Duke Porphyrio stood to the side of his nephew's sedan chair with a hangover. He'd clearly rolled out of bed the moment he'd heard Gerard was in the throne room, not even bothering to splash some water on the bags under his eyes. The splotches on his neck were proof that he'd also been with a whore or two, and he put forth zero effort to conceal them, standing proudly in his mess. Radburn gave a weak, apologetic smile as he wiped his mouth with a kerchief and went on.
To justice. As of now, I am unhappy to report the trail has gone cold. Your men are welcome to patrol our borders and take any measures necessary to find the emerald, if you'll excuse me.
Gerard gave a bow, and Radburn nodded. The servants lifted the handles of the sedan and hauled their weakling prince away, just as another coughing episode took hold. The Duke, hands folded behind his back, wandered from the throne room and into the map room, where they could have a private word. Gerard followed, shutting the door behind him and waiting for the Duke to speak. A shadow of amusement played on Porphyrio's face, watching the neighboring prince marinate in his unease for a moment. The Duke was a confident and menacing man, if a bit of a slob. He stood 6 feet tall, and it was clear by the way his doublet fit that there was strength beneath the thick, embroidered fabric. He opened a drawer in his desk and carelessly plucked a black velvet pouch from within. He tipped the small bag upside down and watched the prince's spine straighten as the enormous green gem spilled out and took a dive toward the marble floor, where it would surely shatter. Instead, it landed within the flytrap of Porphyrio's fingers, and he held it in the light for a moment. The great emerald. Gerard remembered to breathe again, and his teeth gnashed together until they hurt. How dare this slime toy with him in such a way? His alliance with the Duke was spotty at best, and worst of all, the blackguard before him was his surest path to the crown. Until then, Gerard would have to hold off on killing him and taking Tovia for his own. The Duke raised his brows lazily and gingerly stowed the jewel away, speaking his condescending question.
You do understand that each time your men capture and torture a suspect to death, that they are actually executing one of my decoys? Decoys, I might add, that are very expensive.
His head cocked slowly to the side. Prince Gerard shrugged.
Casualties. Sometimes my men are too efficient. We have to give the impression that we're really looking for the emerald.
He gave a smug smile.
I'll reimburse you for the decoys.
The Duke gave a friendly, closed-mouthed smile in return, his eyes exploring the giant maps on the wall. In particular, his gaze fell on a section highlighted in red watercolor. His large hand reached for a wolf hair brush, tapping it on the edge of its pot, and extending it toward the red area to paint in addition onto the map.
This will do quite nicely.
The land belonged to the holy men of the Blue Monastery. It was forbidden territory. Gerard shook his head.
Even if I wanted to give you that section, it's impossible. I've been trying for years. No one can claim that land as long as holy men stand on its soil. There are scriptures that say, should the land be taken by an infidel, there would be dire consequences. I even hired an alchemist to introduce the putrid fever. Yet the priests live on, and the alchemist choked to death on an orange.
The Duke blinked.
Then I hope the monastery is flammable,
he said, exposing his teeth in a grin and then erasing the expression with a smack of his lips as he leaned on the map table.
I'm telling you, I can't sign over that land.
Gerard started.
Radburn will be of age within a year's time. He will be crowned and then wed to your vacuous sister. The doctors inform me that you'll only suffer Radburn's rule for weeks before he dies and she becomes stricken with the same illness. Your sister will reign 5 months at the most before she follows him into the grave. We will be kings.
The Duke countered.
If anyone questions us, I've always found the best solution is removing their head.
An enormous blaze of moaning and cracking wood. A tower of smoke and embers. The flames licking at the timber, oranges and yellows dancing across his stubbled face. His pupils glowing. Duke Porfirio sat high atop his stallion, watching the humble monastery burn to ash. The holy men were nowhere to be found. Farmers stopped to watch from a distance, their wives and daughters crying. How could anyone be so vile? A lavish carriage followed the same road, and the woman within ordered the driver to a halt. Drawing back the curtain, an elegant lady peered out at the inferno, her brows drawing together at the sight of the man on his horse watching calmly. She grit her teeth in a rage and knocked on the outside of the carriage twice to alert the driver to move onward. End of episode 2.